Hello, everybody. Yesterday we talked about the rise of dictators in Europe and also Asia in the post World War I era. And instead of jumping straight into the start of the war and stuff, I thought it might be advantageous to also talk about some of the Allied leaders. So we talked about some of the what Americans view as the bad guys. I thought it might be better to talk about some of the good guys now, so then when we, talk about these people later in major events, it'll kind of resonate a little bit more. So today we're talking about the rise of the Allies. Because this is a U.S. history class, we're going to focus primarily on American leaders. While there are some other leaders, of course, that are important, this is an American scope, so we're going to focus more on them. We are going to talk about Winston Churchill of England a little bit because he is important even on the American side. However, there are a few others. This man right here, Bernard Montgomery, he's the British Army commander of English troops, and then this guy down here who we're not really going to talk much about, Charles de Gaulle. He's the French leader. He's going to fight Nazi resistance in France. But besides that, we're going to talk about the other individuals in more detail. So let's get started. Our objective question for today: who were the major Allied leaders during World War I? First, of course, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, the President of the United States. He's going to be the President of the United States for a majority of World War II. As we get into the war and stuff, we'll talk more about Lend-Lease, but this is going to be his policy for aiding the Allies before we get involved. And then after Pearl Harbor, which is the major event that's going to force America to join the war, he's going to help us shift our economy from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. We've seen that before. We saw that exact same transition in World War I underneath Woodrow Wilson, and FDR is going to do the same thing. All right, my computer is frozen. Okay. All right, I think I got that figured out. And then he's also active in planning the war strategy against the people we end up fighting, the Axis powers. Excellent. Here's a great picture. We have FDR here, Winston Churchill, who we'll talk about in just a minute, and Joseph Stalin, who, if you remember, we talked about yesterday when we talked about the rise of the dictators. So interesting that these three people are together. More on that later. All right, next up, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Oh, he's so cool. Let's talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be very successful in World War I. He's going to help us fight in North Africa. He's going to help us fight in Italy. This is where he gains a lot of his prestige. He's then promoted to the Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe, which means out of all of the people we're fighting alongside, so England, France, some other countries are going to join, right? Out of all of those troops, Eisenhower is the person who's put in ultimate control of all of the Allies. So a very important position, a very prominent position, one that he's going to, take very seriously. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, in terms of World War II, his biggest claim to fame is Operation D-Day. And this is one we'll talk about in a lot of detail next week. But for now, just know that he plans and oversees it. Here's a picture of him talking to troops right before D-Day. Here's some more pictures. Here's some more. Cool. A great quote from Eisenhower, if I can move. Oh, shoot. Hang on a second. Oh wow, I thought I paused my video and I didn't. Darn it. That's alright. Awkward. Here's a great quote from him. I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity. Right? So when we talk about these, especially military generals and leaders, it's hard for us to kind of imagine them in any other way, besides, completely surrounded by war, but it's often important to remind ourselves that these are regular people, and Dwight D. Eisenhower specifically hates war. But he sees this war as a necessary war, which is why he's willing to lead. All right, next, General George S. Patton. Patton's going to be another really important American leader. He's going to have some great success in the North African campaign that we'll talk about a little bit later. He's also going to have some command in the Normandy invasion, the D-Day invasion, and he's going to be great at riling up the troops, keeping morale high, and marching them into Germany as we get our victory. So, interesting character there. Dies shortly after the war in like a freak accident, a car accident. Very interesting. Here's Patton in a victory parade. Cool. Here's a great quote from him. Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best, it removes all that is base. All men are afraid in battle. The coward is the one who lets his fear overcome his sense of duty. Duty is the essence of manhood. All right, well, so kind of the opposite of Dwight D. Eisenhower there. It seems like this guy is obsessed with war, loves war, he loves what it does, and he loves that it brings out, who you truly are. Are you a man or a mouse, is what he's going to say. So interesting take there. Douglas MacArthur, another really interesting individual. We have a lot of really fascinating people to look at in this unit. So Douglas MacArthur, in the same way that Eisenhower is the supreme Allied commander of all troops in Europe, General Douglas MacArthur is going to have that same command in the Pacific. So World War II, as we'll talk about, has multiple theaters of war. The primary ones being Europe and the Pacific, of course. So Douglas MacArthur is going to do a lot of fighting against, obviously, the Japanese. He's actually forced to flee the Philippines when the Japanese attack and invade Manila. As he leaves, he kind of, looks back and says, I'll be back. And he does. He, of course, comes back. That's where this little graphic right here, this is him, coming back to the Philippines, fulfilling his promise that he would be back. So, pretty cool. He's the one who actually gets to accept the formal surrender of the Japanese when they finally surrender in 1945. So, more on that later, but really cool guy. We're going to continue to look at him. Here's some picture of FDR looking at a giant map. Cool. This is a great quote from MacArthur. The soldier above all others prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. So MacArthur really showing the depth of his understanding of what, war does to soldiers and the people who are actually doing the fighting. People at home in countries always say, pray for the troops, and MacArthur's saying, believe me, the troops are praying too, sometimes harder than y'all. And last but not least, the only non-American we're going to talk about in any detail today, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, complete, fascinating individual. If you get any chance to read anything about Churchill or by Churchill, you will be amazed of everything he actually has been involved in, right? But for our purposes, he fights in World War I. He actually helps the English invent the tank, so that's kind of cool. He is very suspicious, skeptical, and scared of the Nazis prior to the outbreak of the war. It's kind of like I saw this coming a long time ago. He's also going to be very, very critical of the Prime Minister before him, Neville Chamberlain, who uses a policy of appeasement to deal with Hitler, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. Very critical of it. He becomes the Prime Minister after Neville Chamberlain resigns. And Winston Churchill is going to be, more than FDR, I would say, outspoken about the idea that we absolutely cannot accept a partial surrender from the Germans. We can't accept an armistice. We need what he pushes for called an unconditional surrender. We need the Nazis to unconditionally surrender to the Allies. And he gains a lot of support in England. He's a very popular prime minister, and he really rallies together not just the English but the Allies with these broadcasts and these great speeches that he gives. We'll probably look at in more detail some of his speeches as we move forward, but he was basically giving the same fireside chats that FDR is. He was basically the FDR for the English people. All right, that's it. Those are the major leaders of the Allies. We've got our president, we have the English prime minister, we have a couple really important military leaders. And, obviously, I do want to mention, right, this is an American history class, as I mentioned earlier. So this is by and far no way close to all of the important Allied leaders. These are just the important ones we need to know for our purposes. All right, make sure you answer your objective sheets. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.